Okay, so I want to thank everybody that is attending today, our special presentation, New Jersey State Parks. I want to thank, so we have Kevin Woyce here. He's an author, photographer, lecturer. He's specializing in the regional American history. And as we have today, we've got New Jersey State Parks will be our theme. Hopefully, we'll be inspired to take advantage of our summer months and go out and do some exploring, which I mean, it's just, I'm sure, equally as beautiful once the leaves change in the fall. So this is something we can definitely all put in our back pocket and think about as we go forward. And as I said before, this will be recorded. We will be putting it up on the Upper Saddle River Library YouTube page. So with that, I am going to mute myself as well, and I will let Kevin take it away.
Okay, well, good evening. I'd like to thank everybody for logging in and watching tonight. My name is Kevin Woyce. I am an author and a photographer. So I'll be showing you a lot of pictures I've taken over the years as we look into the history that took place in and around New Jersey state parks. People have asked me what started me looking into the history of these parks, or writing or speaking about them. And the fact is, I grew up here in New Jersey. I lived here my whole life. And we all know how people outside of the state sometimes imagine New Jersey. They think of an urban landscape, or an industrial landscape, or maybe a tangle of highways. And there are times it's not hard to see why they think that. I took this picture just a few blocks from my home here in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. That's the Route 3 bridge over the Passaic River. But there is another side to New Jersey, and that's the one I'd like to talk about this evening. I took this picture a few years ago in a place called Hacklebarney State Park. That is one of 28 state parks we have here in New Jersey, and 28 is just counting the places that are named something state park. It doesn't include, say, the state forests or any of the other natural or historic sites run or maintained by the state. Also doesn't include any of the national, county, or local park areas. A big part of what makes New Jersey so much fun to explore is that even though we live in one of the smaller states, these parks cover such a wide range of territory. So, for example, in the northwestern part of the state, we've got parks high up in the mountains surrounding lakes, including this lake at Kittatinny Valley State Park, just south of Newton. Throughout the program, I will be putting a map on the screen to give you at least a rough idea of where these parks are located. That name, Kittatinny, well, that meant endless mountain in the language of New Jersey's very first settlers. Not the English and not even the Dutch, but the Lenni Lenape. They migrated here between 8 and 10,000 years ago, came in from the Northwest, and have been here for so long, their name can be translated as the original people. And Kittatinny, or Endless Mountain, is what they called the Appalachians. Now, the highest of those mountains here in New Jersey is a little over 1,800 feet. The peak overlooks Lake Marcia. It was the state geologist who named the lake back in 1855, named it after his fiancée. But the area around the lake would get a much better known name in the late 1880s thanks to a businessman out of Port Jervis, New York. His name was Charles St. John, and he made his fortune in the lumber industry. Well, he bought the property around the lake and then built a resort hotel up above the lake shore facing New Jersey's highest peak. So he called this the Inn at High Point. The property was sold again in 1910 to businessman, naturalist, philanthropist Anthony Cooser. Mr. Cooser was on the board of directors of more than 50 companies. So he bought this enormous property as a summer estate, renamed the inn Cooser Lodge, and used it as a summer home for a few years. Sadly, the building is no longer standing, but for several decades it did serve as a park office and museum, because in 1923, Mr. Cooser donated all of this property to the state, and it became High Point State Park. There was one condition on this gift. I mentioned he was a naturalist. Well, he was very interested in birds. In fact, he funded expeditions to the Far East to study the exotic birds there. So when he gave the property to the state, it was with the understanding that there would be no bird hunting allowed within the park. 5 years later, 1928, he put up another $500,000 to build this monument on top of High Point. It's over 200 feet high, it's made of granite, and it's modeled after the monument at Bunker Hill in Massachusetts. Very popular attraction in the 1930s. Back then, it was 25 cents admission, 10 cents for children, but they were getting as many as 350,000 visitors every year. The tower is also dedicated to all New Jersey war veterans, and it was designed to serve a practical purpose. If you look very closely at the top of the tower, you can see that there's a small window on each side. After dark, they used to turn on a powerful light inside there that would shine through the windows. The light could be seen from quite a distance, and early airplane pilots would use that light to figure out where they were, and from there, how to plot a course to the nearest airport. From the top of the tower, when it's occasionally open, or just from the top of High Point itself, which is where I took this picture from, you get great views of large parts of New Jersey, New York, eastern Pennsylvania. High Point is our second largest state park, more than 15,000 acres, but our very largest, twice that size, more than 30,000 acres. In fact, Wawayanda State Park is so big that several miles of the Appalachian Trail run through it. When I first started researching the parks and told friends of mine what I was working on, one of their first questions, "Are you going to tell us what Wawayanda means?" Well, of course I will. That name is another gift of the Lenape, who lived in these mountains. They originally used that word to describe a river, so it meant something like winding water or wandering river. Later settlers also used the name for the mountain and for this lake. Strangely, nobody ever got so creative when it came time to name the two islands in the lake. Those are still known as the Twin Islands. Back in 1886, the YMCA chose one of those islands as part of their very first summer camp. The camp has moved a bunch of times since then. It's been located in New York's Catskill Mountains since the 1950s. But back when the YMCA was using this island, campers got out there on little ferry boats that were pulled across the lake using ropes. So here in New Jersey, we've got parks ranging from these high mountains and lakes to, well, one of my favorite parts of the state, and that's our seacoast, our Jersey Shore, where we've got 4 state parks. And 2 of those are built around historic lighthouses. And if there's a lighthouse nearby, I will be there to take pictures, and if it's open to the public, I'm climbing to the top to take pictures from up top. So we've got Barnegat Light State Park, where the tower that's become known as Old Barney overlooks the last patch of coastal forest on Long Beach Island. The name fits. It is the longest island on the shore, about 18 miles. And then down near the southern tip of the state, we've got the lighthouse at Cape May Point, built the same year as Old Barney, 1859. Both of these lights are still in use. Now, the spiral staircase in the Cape May Lighthouse has 199 steps in it. If you climb to the top, you can look out at the beaches and trails and wetlands of Cape May Point State Park. Looking to the north, you can see the city of Cape May. You might see the wildwoods. I've been told that on the very clearest days, looking to the south, you can see all the way across the mouth of Delaware Bay to Cape Henlopen State Park in southern Delaware. I've yet to climb the tower on a day quite that clear. But because Cape May Point is on a narrow strip of land between the Atlantic Ocean and Delaware Bay, it's a stopping point on a lot of migrations, and that makes it one of the most popular parks for bird watching. In the spring, you'll see the shorebirds flying north. Late summer, you can see the monarch butterflies and the dragonflies. And come autumn, you'll have enormous flocks of birds passing overhead. So many that since 1967, the Cape May Raptor Banding Project has been capturing, tagging, and releasing falcons and hawks, even eagles, to track their populations. They tag as many as 2,500 birds every year. Now, I have to say, the one you see on the screen, I photographed a few years back at a Native American Arts Festival. They were doing a demonstration showing how these birds were trained for hunting. But I guess about 3 summers ago, I drove out to Waterloo Village. That's located in Alamuchi Mountain State Park, which we'll visit a little later. As I was walking back to the parking lot, I spotted this one on top of a wooden post, and so perfectly still that at first glance, I thought it was just a decoration or a sculpture, at least until it turned to look at me. Or more accurately, they can look right through you. Corson's Inlet is a rather unusual state park because it is split in half by the inlet that it's named after. So the northern part of the park is at the south end of Ocean City, while the southern part of the park is in the town of Strathmere. You can walk between them on that highway bridge in the background. There are two different stories about where Corson's Inlet got its name. They both involve a pair of brothers, John and Peter Corson, who worked in the whaling industry of the late 1600s. By some accounts, these brothers simply established a whaling camp at the inlet. But the more popular story, especially in that part of the state, is that they served in the crew of a whaling ship, and that they were such troublemakers, their captain stranded them at the inlet. Either way, it's been Corson's Inlet ever since. The biggest of the state parks along the shore is Island Beach, just south of Seaside. It's actually the longest stretch of undeveloped coastline in the state, about 10 miles of beaches and sand dunes. But that name, Island Beach, that's not really accurate. It hasn't been an island since 1812. That's the year separating it from the rest of that's the year the inlet that separated it from the rest of the long, narrow Barnegat Peninsula filled in with sand. This is a view from the state park looking north along that peninsula. And I keep this program even though this picture is now more than 10 years out of date. This is a pre-Sandy photograph because in the distance you can still see the amusement piers and Seaside Heights, which were destroyed by that storm. They have built some new attractions in their place. But before the shore was as built up as it is today, it was not unusual for these inlets to fill in with sand, to reopen during storms, or even to gradually shift north or south along the coast. The one that used to separate Island Beach was called Cranberry Inlet because the captains of sailing ships used to anchor near there to buy barrels of cranberries from the farmers in the Pine Barrens. And we still have cranberry farms in that part of the state. In fact, the one on the screen is located in another of our state parks. Maybe my favorite name for a New Jersey state park, Double Trouble. The name goes back to the 1700s when a farmer who owned that property built a dam across one of the waterways. Twice in one season, floods washed it out. He called the spot Double Trouble. The name stuck. The building in the background is part of the park's historic village. It was built in the early 1900s as the packing and sorting house for a cranberry company. The machine in front of the porch is used for the annual harvest. Most years there is a working farm in the park, and if you visit there, say, early to mid-October, you might be just in time to watch the harvest. Although, despite what you may have seen on television commercials for cranberry juice, those cranberries are not grown in water up to your waist. They're grown in the bogs, but they are grown on dry land. The bogs are only flooded at harvest time because ripe cranberries float, which makes them easier to pick. Heading back out to Island Beach, when I first started researching and writing about New Jersey history, I was working on a book about the history of the Jersey Shore. And when I was writing that, I was mostly interested in how the shore developed, how a lot of the towns became the places we know today. Here we are at the top of Barnegat Lighthouse, looking out over Barnegat Light State Park and the north end of LBI. But up at Island Beach, it was really the opposite story that unfolded. In 1926, Henry Phipps. He was a former business partner of Andrew Carnegie, part owner of United States Steel. He bought all of Island Beach. And with his business manager, Francis Park Freeman, he was planning on turning this into a very exclusive resort, all estates and mansions. They called the place the Borough of Island Beach. They mapped it out. They even managed to lease a few of those properties. But let's not forget the year they bought it, 1926. 3 years later, the stock market crashed, and that was really the end of their big plans. Development mostly ended at Seaside Park, which you can see in the distance here. This is you looking north from the bay side of Island Beach. New Jersey bought up all of the land in 1953 and opened it as Island Beach State Park in 59. At that time, the state made an agreement with a few people that had already leased properties, stating that they could use the land the rest of their lives, and then it would revert to the state. I believe it's all state property today, but as I was walking the trails, spotted a few signs identifying where some of the old leases had been. And one of the only houses that was ever built down there is now owned by the state and used as a summer home for New Jersey governors. If you take a drive across the state, you'll come to what some people have called New Jersey's other shore, and that's the shoreline of Delaware Bay, where just below the mouth of the Delaware River, you'll find Fort Mott State Park. And it shouldn't surprise you to hear that the state park is named after an actual fort that was built there in the 1890s to protect the entrance to the river, which was lined with major industrial cities like Trenton, Philadelphia, and Camden, with their shipyards and factories and warehouses. But this was a very unusual fort. It was built into a hillside, so from out on the bay, you wouldn't see a fort, you would just see the hillside. They had guns there that could hit a ship from 8 miles away. They were never fired except for target practice, but you wouldn't even see those until it was too late, because those guns were raised and lowered with steam engines. They only raised them when they planned to use them. Those were removed in the 1920s. New Jersey acquired the property for a park in the early 40s. These days, you can take a self-guided walking tour of the grounds, and when it's open, of the fort itself. And if wandering through those old concrete tunnels, especially on as gloomy a day as it was when I got down there, if that isn't spooky enough for you, most summers you can catch a ferry from this dock in the park, and that will bring you out to the island you see across the top of the screen, Peapatch Island. 1859, the government built a fort out there. That one was called Fort Delaware, and during the Civil War, it served as a prison. So to this day, a lot of people believe that the island and the fort are haunted by the ghosts of Confederate soldiers who died out there. All of our state parks, as well as the state forests and certain other natural and historic sites, are managed by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, or NJDEP for short. Created on the first Earth Day back in 1970. They maintain a very extensive website. Just type NJDEP into a browser and you'll find it. They've got a page for every one of their properties, every one of the parks, and that's the best place to go if you're looking for basic traveling information, park hours, where you're going to have to pay parking or other fees, and especially with all of the cutbacks and closures in recent years, be sure to check which activities are available, which facilities are open. It's also a good place to download basic maps of the parks. Again, due to budget cuts, many of the parks do not have full-time offices any longer, and as I was exploring them, it was often difficult to get a printed map once you were there. And if you have a sense of direction like mine, you need all the help you can get. A forerunner of the NJDEP was the Forest Park Reservation Commission, created very early in the 20th century during the term of Governor Edward Stokes. Stokes State Forest was named after him in 1907. Despite its name, the commission was not originally involved in parks. Oh, the public was welcome to visit the forests. You could go hiking or camping or hunting or fishing. But the real purpose of the commission was to preserve those woodlands for the lumber industry. So most of their efforts went to fighting or better yet, trying to prevent the fires that were destroying thousands of acres every year. They finally got into the park business in 1914, and this is one of the reasons. That's Swartzwood Lake out in western Sussex County. By the late 1800s, the area around the lake was becoming a popular summer resort. There were picnic groves on the lake shore, summer homes and hotels in the hills. People would head out there to spend the day swimming or boating or fishing. But in 1888, Andrew Albright, who owned a saddle factory in Newark, built a big estate on the lakeshore. And according to his property title, he had also managed to buy all of the property underneath the lake. So he began charging people to use his lake. $1 a day. Might sound like a bargain today, but a lot of money in the 1880s. And if you wouldn't pay up, he would take you to court. And he was winning these cases. So in 1907, the state passed a law that allowed the Forest Park Reservation Commission to buy freshwater lakes and ponds and some of the surrounding property to preserve as parks. Using this law, the commission bought Swartzwood from Mr. Albright's heirs in 1914 and opened it up later that year as our very first state park. It's grown quite a bit since then through purchases and donations. One of the picnic groves on the lakeshore was owned by a man named George Emmons. He quickly donated his area to the state, and that section is still called Emmons Grove today. A lot of our parks were developed for visitors in the 1930s, often as part of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, trying to put money back into the economy, trying to get people working again. One of the New Deal agencies was called the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, and it was WPA workers who created, or literally dug, all 3 of the lakes at a park in central New Jersey that's named after a creek flowing into Raritan Bay. Well, sort of. Actually, the Lenape name did not originally refer to the creek. It described the villages they had in the hills on either side. So the word meant something like upland village or upland people. If they had had a written language, we might spell the park's name something like this. Big problem with not having a written language is somebody else puts those words down on paper, and some of those people had some strange ideas about spelling. Cheesequake means absolutely nothing, but it does give you something to chuckle about as you're driving the Garden State Parkway. The park was established in 1938. When the parkway was built in the early 1950s, it cuts right through the center of Cheesequake State Park. But hey, at least the park got to keep its name. The nearby rest area on the parkway, that's been renamed after John Bon Jovi. And although the work here was done by the WPA, most of the work in parks and forests around the nation was done by another New Deal agency, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. This was modeled after a program that Roosevelt had tried a few years earlier when he was governor of the state of New York, designed to provide temporary jobs for young men ages 18 to 24. They would be enlisted for 6 months at a time, but could remain on the job for up to 2 years. Remember that it was the 1930s and the depths of the Depression when I tell you that they were paid about $30 a month. Out of that, about 25 were sent home to their families. While you served in the Corps, you lived in camps that were set up almost like military bases, so not a lot of need for spending money. But by the middle of the 1930s, the Corps was employing 500,000 men, scattered through 2,600 camps all around the United States. 22 of those were here in New Jersey, including one way down near the city of Vineland in South Jersey at Parvin State Park. Parvin had been a privately owned lake resort, but in the 1920s, the second generation owner, he speculated a little too heavily in the stock market. After the market crashed, he found himself deeply in debt, and the only way he could get out was to offer this property for sale. Well, we didn't have any state parks down that way yet, so the state bought it from him, and the CCC did a lot of work in this park. They rebuilt the dam. The original, which is what created the lake in the first place, dated back to the 1780s. They built bridges over the park's waterways. This one has always been known as the White Bridge. But they also built the park's picnic shelters. They built rental cabins that are still in use. And they even built the main entranceway and bathhouses on the lakeshore. This building was also an early attempt at recycling. All of the brick they used was salvaged from a row of buildings that had just been demolished in Philadelphia. In the early 1940s, the CCC also created a second lake for the park. This one is known as Thundergust Lake. Another of the camps was located in northern Hunterdon County in Voorhees State Park. Now, if you visit Voorhees State Park, if you walk to the top of the highest and steepest trail in that park, you'll come across a pair of stone armchairs. They don't look inviting in the photograph, but I was kind of glad to see them. This property started out as a farm called Hill Acres. It was owned by a man named Foster Voorhees, who left it to the state in his will. He died in 1927. But back in 1899, Foster Voorhees was elected governor of New Jersey. And shortly after taking office, he received a petition from the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs, asking him if he could find a way to save the Palisades, the line of cliffs running along the west side of the Hudson River. Quarry companies were blasting away at these cliffs, removing thousands of tons of rock at a time, most of which was going to be crushed to make gravel to pave the streets of New York City. Well, there was no agency yet for creating state parks. Governor Voorhees knew it would be very expensive to buy out the quarries, so he admitted he didn't think there was much he could do. Luckily, New York had also elected a new governor that year. Theodore Roosevelt was just back from leading the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War and would soon become one of our first conservation-minded presidents. So working together, the two governors created the Palisades Interstate Park Commission with the purpose of ending the quarrying and preserving the Palisades as a park and a landmark. With a donation from one of their wealthy friends, that's the banker J.P. Morgan, the commission bought out the largest of the quarries. It was in Fort Lee on Christmas Eve, 1900. 9 years later, the Palisades Interstate Park opened to the public, runs for 14 miles from Fort Lee, New Jersey, all the way up to Piermont, New York. In the following decades, the commission went on to purchase and preserve a lot of other properties along the Hudson in New York State, most famously Bear Mountain and Harriman State Parks. But here in New Jersey, the Palisades were not the only landmark that had to be saved from a quarry company. In the spring of 1777, George Washington camped his army in the Watchung Mountains. Didn't have a very large army, so he was hoping to avoid battle in the coming months. But to do that, he needed to know where the British army was and what they were doing. So at the base of the mountains, he met a group of farmers and asked if they knew of a spot he might use as a lookout. One of the men said he knew the perfect space. So Washington loaned him one of his officers' horses and then followed him up a winding trail to the top of a mountain where there were two large rock outcrops. From the bigger of the two, you could see for miles in every direction. After the war, that one became known as Washington Rock, while the smaller rock nearby was called Lafayette Rock. The Marquis had been traveling with the army that summer. Through much of the 19th century, the rocks were painted white so you could see them from a distance, and the area around them became popular for picnics, patriotic holidays, political rallies. There were some summer homes and hotels nearby as well. But by the start of the 20th century, a quarry company was chipping away at the hill below these rocks. So a local family bought the quarry and then resold it to the state for $1. 1913, the Daughters of the American Revolution had the rubble from the quarry used to make this stone wall connecting the two rocks. They're also responsible for the flagpole monument up above. And eventually, this became part of the state park system as Washington Rock State Park. That's one of 4 New Jersey state parks celebrating our state's role in the American Revolution. Historians sometimes call New Jersey the crossroads of the Revolution. It seems there were more battles, skirmishes, naval engagements fought in and around New Jersey than in any of the other colonies. This is the Washington Crossing Bridge over the Delaware River, about 9 miles north of Trenton. Steel bridge, it opened in 1904. Well, the stone piers that support it, they date back to 1832. They were built to carry a wooden covered bridge. There are parks on both sides of the river here, and this photograph was taken on the Pennsylvania side in Washington Crossing Historic Park. The building is McConkey's Ferry Inn. Mr. McConkey ran the ferry boats across that part of the river in colonial days. George Washington used the inn as a watch post for a few weeks in December of 1776, and is said to have dined here with his officers on Christmas night before making the famous crossing back into New Jersey. 1776 had not been a great year for Washington or the Continental Army. They did lose Long Island, and then Manhattan and New York City, and then had to retreat across New Jersey with what was left of the army, about 3,000 men. They then crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania, where they established winter quarters along 30 miles of the west bank of the river. To keep the British from following, Washington made sure all the boats on the New Jersey side were either hidden or sunk. It probably didn't have to go to that much effort. The British had no intention of fighting in the winter. They had settled into their own winter quarters. They left a force of Hessian troops to guard the town of Trenton, and they figured the winter itself should be enough to wipe out Washington's army. And they had good reason to believe that. Most of the men in that army, their enlistments were running out December 31st, and they were ready to go home. So Washington knew if he was going to keep the army together to continue the war in the coming year, he needed to inspire these men. He needed a victory. So he worked out a plan that on Christmas night, he pulled in reinforcements from Pennsylvania and also down from New England. And on Christmas night, they would divide the combined army into 3 columns. They would cross the river in the dark, land in New Jersey, then march down along the riverbank, arriving in Trenton before sunrise. They would take the defenders by surprise and capture the town. Well, nothing happened quite the way they were planning it. A snowstorm blew in, the river began to freeze. Only one of those 3 columns successfully crossed the river. Not surprisingly, that was the one that Washington himself was leading. Where they landed is now Washington Crossing State Park, which has a small Revolutionary War museum, a couple of historic ferry buildings, some walking trails. On screen, you can see a modern reproduction of a wooden ferry boat from those days. Several others are kept on the Pennsylvania side because most years they do stage a reenactment of that Christmas crossing, weather permitting. But after landing here in you can see it doesn't look much like the boat in the famous painting. Then again, most historians will tell you the only thing accurate about that painting is the fact the river was freezing that night. So they land here in New Jersey. They then have to march 9 miles along the riverbank through a snowstorm, dragging their cannons. They do not reach Trenton before sunrise, but they still manage to take the defenders by surprise, because who's expecting an attack the morning after Christmas during a snowstorm? Better yet, the Hessians had not bothered to fortify a strategic hill, even though the British left instructions for them to do that. So Washington put his guns up there instead, aimed them down into the town. It was a short battle. It was an American victory. He quickly moved his army back across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. In 1893, the Trenton Battle Monument was set up to mark that spot. Although it's a good 9 or 10 miles from Washington Crossing State Park, it is preserved as part of the park. At the top of the column, there's a 13-foot statue of Washington giving the order to fire the cannons. And the man in charge of those guns that morning was a very young Alexander Hamilton. This is before he became a famous rapper on Broadway. Well, from either Trenton or Washington Crossing, it's only a short drive up to Princeton Battlefield State Park. These columns are all that remain of a mansion that burned down there in the 1950s. Encouraged by the victory at Trenton, Washington offered his troops an extra $10 a man. Good amount of money in those days, and he offered it out of his own personal fortune. He offered if they would stay for just another 6 weeks. Most of them accepted, so early in the new year, he launched another surprise attack across the river, this time on the British garrison defending Princeton. Another short battle and another American victory. Now, when they had set out that morning, Washington was considering marching all the way to New Brunswick to capture the British supplies stored there. But after the fighting at Princeton, decided not to push his luck. Instead, turned the army north toward Morristown, where they established new winter quarters, and part of that property is now maintained by the National Park Service. At Princeton, a lot of the fighting took place within sight of Thomas Clark's farmhouse. The house is preserved as a Revolutionary War museum because this is where, during and after the battle, soldiers from both armies were treated for their injuries. One of the men who was brought here after the battle but soon died of his wounds was the American general Hugh Mercer. Story goes that after being bayoneted by British troops, General Mercer refused to be taken from the battlefield. He wanted to stay with his men. They say he rested under a large oak tree, and after the war, that became known as the Mercer Oak. Survived until just about 15 years ago when it blew over in a windstorm. But the general hasn't been forgotten. Mercer County, New Jersey is named after him, and these early victories did not go unnoticed overseas. Over the next few years, a group of European military officers would sail across to offer their expertise to Washington's army. One of those was the Prussian Baron von Steuben. He's the man who trained during the winter that the army was camped at Valley Forge, 1777 to 78. He trained the American officers to then train the troops to maneuver more like a European army, to charge with bayonets. The idea being that they might finally face the British on the open battlefield, rather than relying on these surprise attacks and clever retreats. You'll find this statue of him right outside the Visitors Center at Monmouth Battlefield State Park, because that's where this training was put to the test in June of 1778. The Visitors Center is on top of a hill overlooking the farms and fields and orchards where the battle was fought. Late in the afternoon, the American General Nathaniel Greene moved 4 cannons to the top of that hill. With those guns, he drove the British artillery off the battlefield, opening the way for an American infantry attack. And late in the day, the British retreated back to their camp. Now, the British had already been on the march across New Jersey when Washington caught up with them at Monmouth. So that night, the British left their campfires burning so it would look like the camp was still occupied. And then, as quietly as possible, they resumed their march towards Sandy Hook, where their fleet was waiting. And that night, the larger part of the British Army boarded those ships and left New Jersey, never to return, making this the last major battle fought in our state, although fighting did continue until the early 1780s. The battle at Monmouth was fought on a very hot afternoon. Temperatures near 100, men on both sides are dropping from the heat. So luckily for some of the American soldiers, it was not uncommon for soldiers' wives to travel with the armies back then. One of the American gunners was named William Hayes. His wife's name was probably Mary, but most people called her by her nickname. They knew her as Molly. And the story goes that she found a spring on the battlefield, and the men would call out to her, "Molly, bring the pitcher." Some historians say she was likelier using a bucket than a pitcher, but just doesn't have the same ring to it. And the reason she's remembered is that after her husband was injured, she took his place at the cannon. When the fighting was done, George Washington himself commended her for her bravery. A lot of the orchards and farms are still in operation, even though they're located in the state park. So throughout the year, visitors can go there to pick their own apples, peaches, strawberries, even pumpkins in season. But during the Revolution, New Jersey was not only the site of these battles and retreats. Iron forges, like this one near the shore of Lake Wawayanda, were producing weapons and tools that the army needed. In northern New Jersey, you've got veins of iron ore that parallel the mountain ranges. Some may stretch for miles, others could be only a few feet wide, but people started looking for this iron in the 1600s. The way they did that was by digging shafts down into the mountain. If they hit a vein, they then tunneled in from the side of the mountain to dig out that ore. A lot of work. So that's why in colonial days, most of the iron produced in New Jersey came from the central part of the state, down in the Pine Barrens, where a lot of the springs and rivers, or a lot of the streams and rivers and bogs are fed by springs. And there is so much iron dissolved in that spring water that when it mixes with the clay and sand of the riverbanks, it forms lumps of what they call bog iron. Nowhere near as pure as what you would dig out of the mountains. In fact, it's only about 30% iron, but no tunneling involved. You could literally pick this up by hand. And it was a renewable resource. Every 25, 30 years, you could visit the same areas and find fresh deposits forming. Now, to separate the iron out of the ore, you had to heat it to about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, the molten iron, which was very heavy, would separate and sink to the bottom of the furnace, leaving the lighter impurities, what they called slag, floating on top. About twice a day, they would skim off the slag so they could collect the valuable iron. Of course, to keep temperatures that high, you had to keep those furnaces burning 24 hours a day, which is why until coal was discovered out in Pennsylvania, thousands of acres of New Jersey forests, including most of the woods in Sussex County, were cut and burned to make charcoal to fuel these furnaces. The one on the screen was built in the 1790s and is preserved as part of the historic village in Allaire State Park. The park is named after James Peter Allaire, who ran a steam engine factory in New York City. He actually built the engines for some of Robert Fulton's first steamships. In order to have a steady supply of iron, he bought the forge and about 10,000 acres of the surrounding forests and bogs. Only problem? The property was so far from any established city or town, he had to build his own. He built brick row houses for his workers. The only one still standing now serves as the park office and museum. He also built a church and a school, a company store that was once the largest retail building in the state. This is now occupied by the park's general store. The park also includes a working bakery and a blacksmith shop. Mr. Allaire left very little to chance. He ran his own stagecoach line to move the iron from here up to the depots at Eatontown and Red Bank. Later had his own steamships running from there up to New York City. But by the 1840s, he's having trouble competing with cheaper ore coming from northern New Jersey, from Pennsylvania, and the shores of the Great Lakes. So when he retired in 1850, he closed down the whole operation. After he died in 1858, one of his sons lived on the property alone for several decades. As the surrounding areas began to develop, people started calling this the abandoned village. Well, that changed in 1907 when the property was bought by a syndicated newspaper columnist named Arthur Brisbane. He later leased part of it to the local Boy Scouts who did the first restoration work on the old buildings. It was possible to make a fortune in the New Jersey iron industry. Just ask Peter Cooper. He was a businessman, philanthropist, inventor, built the first steam locomotive here in the United States in 1830, called it the Tom Thumb, and he built it to prove a point, to convince the owners of the new Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that they should use locomotives rather than horses to pull their train cars. A race was arranged, Tom Thumb won, and Peter Cooper made a fortune selling the B&O iron rails. In 1853, he bought the mines at Ringwood with his business partner, Abram Hewitt. Mr. Hewitt would later be elected mayor of New York. The mines had already been open for more than 100 years, had several different owners. During the Revolution, they were run by a Robert Erskine, who helped to forge part of a giant chain that was used to block the Hudson River up by Bear Mountain. He also drew several hundred maps for George Washington. Early 1800s, the property was sold to a man named Martin Ryerson, who built himself a 10-room manor house there. Well, in 1855, Abram Hewitt married Peter Cooper's only daughter. Her name was Sarah. They moved into the old manor house and decided to enlarge it. Just a bit. Okay, by the time their heirs left the house to the state, it had 51 rooms, 24 fireplaces, and well over 200 windows. They don't allow photography inside, but very interesting building to take a guided tour of because it was built over a long period of time. You see how the architecture and the interior decorating change from room to room, section to section. Sarah was also very interested in gardening, so around the house you can see the gardens that she designed, and those are still decorated with sculptures and statues that she and Abram collected as they traveled the world. And if you enjoy visiting either mansions or gardens, you'll want to spend a little bit longer at Ringwood State Park, because in 1891, Francis Lind Stetson, he was J.P. Morgan's personal lawyer, created a mountaintop estate that he called Skylands Farms. The property was sold in 1922 to investment banker Charles Mackenzie Lewis, who built himself a 45-room mansion house that he called Skylands Manor. Because it looked like a castle from outside, he decorated the interior with antique paneling he brought over from England and 400-year-old stained glass windows he got in Germany. Today, it's a popular site for weddings and other events. But Mr. Lewis was also very interested in gardening. He was a trustee of the New York Botanical Garden, and he spent 30 years collecting trees and plants from all over the world for his property. At one point, he had 60 gardeners working for him. New Jersey acquired the property as part of Ringwood State Park in the 1960s, and in 1984, Governor Thomas Kean dedicated part of that as the New Jersey Botanical Garden. The iron from the Ringwood mines was processed at what's now Long Pond Iron Works State Park. Long Pond was the colonial name for Greenwood Lake. The park includes a museum describing the northern New Jersey iron industry. That building is also the starting point of about a mile-long trail through the park's woods. Along the trail, you see the ruins of various structures used in the iron industry, including this old water wheel and what's left of 3 stone furnaces. One dates back to the late 1700s, the other 2 built in the 1860s. They remained in use until the late 1880s, and local legend maintains that at least one of them was dynamited in 1917 to create a spectacular ending for a silent movie. And that was when the movie industry was still headquartered in Fort Lee along the Palisades. A big challenge for the northern New Jersey iron industry was the cost and difficulty of moving the iron from these mountaintop mines down to the industrial cities. You could load it into wagons, but then they had to be pulled over really bad roads. Things began to improve in the 1830s. 1831, the Morris Canal opened, eventually ran all the way from Phillipsburg on the Delaware River to Jersey City on the Hudson. 3 years later, in 1834, the Delaware and Raritan Canal opened. Main line of the canal ran from Trenton up to New Brunswick, but the canal actually started about 20 miles north of Trenton, where water was let into a narrow canal called a feeder canal. This ran alongside the Delaware River, but raised the water through a series of locks until it reached the canal's summit at Trenton. From there, the canal would run roughly northeast, descending through another series of locks until it reached sea level at the Raritan River in New Brunswick. And except for a small section in Trenton that was paved over in the 1930s, the entire length of the canal is preserved as Delaware and Raritan Canal State Park. And most of the park is only as wide as the old canal and the towpath running alongside of it. That's where the mules would walk to tow those canal boats. Top speed, 4 miles an hour. Along the path, you can see the old stone mile markers. There's a different number on either side of them because the distances are measured from both ends of the canal, parts of which are still used to bring reservoir water to towns along its route. The Morris Canal was a little different. Instead of the Delaware River, that drew most of its water from Lake Hopatcong, where you'll find another state park with a Lenape name. If you believe this old tourist brochure from 1905, the writer claimed that Hopatcong was an old Indian word meaning honey water of many coves. That was dreamed up by somebody looking to sell lakefront property. Historians believe that the Lenape word actually refers to a soft stone in the area. Its modern name is soapstone, but they carved pipes from it. So the name Hopatcong probably meant something like pipestone. Because the canal crosses northern New Jersey, it has to climb mountains. From the Delaware River up to Lake Hopatcong, a change of 760 feet in elevation. From the lake down to sea level at Newark and Jersey City, drops 914 feet. Now, that canal is barely 100 miles long. The locks they had in those days could only raise or lower a boat 20 feet. So on the Morris Canal, boats were actually towed over the hills on rails. They called these inclined planes. There were 23 of them on the canal. The largest was 1,800 feet long and raised or lowered boats 100 feet. But to use these, you needed specially built boats. They were called section boats because they were built in two watertight halves, which were then hinged in the middle. They did this so that when you reached the top of the plane, the boat could gently be lowered into the water without cracking the keel. Those boats were up to 87 feet long, could carry up to 70 tons of cargo. And they moved everything from passengers to manufactured goods to fresh produce. But both of the canals relied very heavily on the iron industry. They were moving ore, they were moving coal, and by the 1870s, both canals were losing a lot of that business to the railroads. One train could move a lot more, could move it a lot faster, and a lot cheaper than any number of canal boats. Now, for a while, you couldn't tell that to the owners of the Morris Canal and Banking Company. Nope, they made plans to enlarge that canal to compete with the railroad. When they realized that was a lost cause, they made plans to enlarge the canal, this time to use it as a water supply for Jersey City. Well, that fell through too, and probably just as well. Like several of the other lakes I've shown you, Hopatcong was becoming the center of a summer resort industry, and enlarging the canal would have meant drawing a lot more water from the lake, and that probably would have killed the resort industry. One of the big property owners up there in the early 1900s, he owned 3 miles of lakefront, was a man named Hudson Maxim. This was the pier on his property. Sadly, this no longer exists. He made his fortune in the explosives industry, eventually sold his patents to the DuPont company, and in 1913 he wrote and self-published a book called Lake Hopatcong the Beautiful, in which he urged the state of New Jersey to close the Morris Canal and to take over Lake Hopatcong for a state park. Now, it's hard to say just how influential his book really was. I'll give you an example of his writing style. He titled a chapter, "The Utter Insignificance of the Morris Canal as a Coal Carrier." But the canal did close down in the 1920s. New Jersey did establish a state park at one end of Lake Hopatcong, and most of the canal was quickly drained and filled in. This is all that remains of one of the old locks near Stevens State Park in western Morris County. Only a few sections of the canal still have water flowing. One of them is in Hopatcong State Park, just below the dam, alongside the lock tender's house, which is now a Morris Canal Museum. The company provided housing for those men because they were on duty from 5 in the morning until 9 at night, 6 days a week. Canal was closed to traffic on Sundays. Another section runs through Alamucci Mountain State Park. This is where the canal ran past Waterloo Village with its store and its old stone mill. Waterloo used to be a really interesting tourist attraction. You got tours of these buildings and of some of the old houses on the property. That lasted until the state had a private company run the place, and that didn't work out. Buildings fell into disrepair and finally were just closed up for a number of years. 3 or 4 summers ago, I read that Waterloo Village was open again, so I drove out there. Open again really just means that the property was open and you could walk the trails. Most of the buildings are still closed up awaiting renovation. One of the few that is opened occasionally is the Museum of the Canal Society of New Jersey, which also gives occasional tours of the park. The last part of the canal with water running is the eastern end of it, where it met the Hudson River at Jersey City. This also happened to be a wide section of the canal, what they called a basin, where you could turn around one of those 87-foot boats. It also happens to be the waterway running along the northern edge of Liberty State Park. Most of that park is built up on landfill placed in the Hudson River in the 19th century by three companies: the Morris Canal and Banking Company, the Central Railroad of New Jersey, which built this terminal there in 1886, and finally the Lehigh Valley Railroad. In the early 1900s, Lehigh Valley Railroad had a mile-long pier in what's now the southern part of the park. It completely covered a small island called Black Tom Island. The name is believed to refer to a fisherman who used to live out there. In this old postcard of Ellis Island, you can see the pier stretching out behind it. Summer of 1916, World War I is raging in Europe. The United States is still neutral officially, but the Lehigh Valley Railroad is storing 1 million tons of explosives on that pier, which are scheduled to be shipped to the Allies. Except that at 2 o'clock in the morning on July 30th, 1 million tons of explosives exploded. 7 people were killed in the blast. Windows shattered for miles around. The shock was felt as far away as Philadelphia. Closer to home, shrapnel punctured the arm of the Statue of Liberty, and the stone ceiling in the Great Hall on Ellis Island collapsed. Thankfully, it was the middle of the night. There was nobody out there, but the islands were kept evacuated until the fires were put out on shore. The investigation dragged on into the 1950s when it was finally blamed on German sabotage. And today there's a circle of flags and a plaque in the southern part of the park identifying the site of the Black Tom explosion. If you ever wanted to ride a train through one of our state parks, you'll need to spend a little bit longer down at Allaire, where the New Jersey Museum of Transportation operates the Pine Creek Railroad. Pine Creek Railroad was started outside of the park in the 1950s as a private company. They were buying and restoring old locomotives and passenger cars and running them on a half-mile track for visitors. One thing you will not see at this museum is the very first locomotive they restored, because they sold that one in the 1960s to Walt Disney. It's still running out at Disneyland in California. And when some of our railroads were no longer needed, the tracks were removed and the roadbeds were converted to multi-use trails. They call these rail trails, and they're popular for walking, sometimes for riding horses. They tend to be easy trails because the railroad already created a level roadway, so you're not climbing mountains. Some of them cross parts of our state parks, including the 20-mile Sussex Branch Trail, follow the route of the old Sussex Branch Railroad that Abram Hewitt founded in the 1850s to move iron ore from Andover down to Waterloo Village. This runs through Alamucci Mountain State Park up into Kittatinny Valley. Kittatinny is also responsible for maintaining the 27-mile Polandskill Valley Trail running across Sussex County. This follows the route of the old New York, Susquehanna, and Western Railroad. The trail is named after the Polandskill River, which it mostly follows, though it also crosses that river a few times on old railroad bridges, including this one near Blairstown. Follow either trail far enough north and they cross at Sparta Junction up in northern Sussex County. And with one last view of one of the lakes down at Cheesequake, we come to the end of our tour of New Jersey state parks. I would like to thank you again for logging in and watching this evening. Hope I've given you a little glimpse of our state's history, but also a reason to get out and do some exploring on your own. See this history and see what a beautiful state we really have for ourselves. If you visit my website, which is simply kevinwoyce.com, you will find a full schedule of when and where I'm speaking, which topics I'll be speaking about. You can also follow me on Facebook at Kevin Woyce Author or at Instagram at Kevin Woyce. On the website, you'll also find information on the books that I've written and illustrated, including one about New Jersey state parks. So again, thanks for watching. And if we have any questions, I'll do my best to try to answer those.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That was very interesting the way you put the history, especially right now with so close to July 4th, but the history with all of the state parks. You know what? I was kind of curious when you were showing the Washington Rock, where the big seatings where the trails were going by. What town was that actually in? I don't think I caught that.
Near Warren.
Near Warren. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to look it up. And for everybody that is watching now, I will send out an email with the link of this. And I will also send the link of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection as well. Because like you said, most of the information is actually in there as well.
Yeah, some of the state parks can be a little bit of a challenge to find. Like Washington Rock, there's one little sign on the road, and that leads to a winding trail up the mountain.
Well, it's part of the hunt.
Yeah.
Thank you again. And if anybody else has any questions, you're getting just in the chat, people are enjoying. Yeah, you really did bring history to life. I would absolutely agree with that. And now we know what Molly Pitcher is when we stop. Although I don't know, like you were saying, they're changing the names of all the different, a lot of the rest stops around here. I don't know if they still are continuing with the Molly Pitcher, but
well,
fun too. That was a fun tidbit.
it was the ones on the Parkway that are
the Parkway,
and those were all named after where they were located, either towns or areas, and they've now been renamed after famous people from New Jersey, from Frank Sinatra to Judy Blume to the one that I insist on referring to as the Tony Soprano rest stop up in the northernmost one. I know it's the James Gandolfini, but you know, it's New Jersey. We've got to have one named after a fictional gangster. Yeah, Molly Pitcher, I think that one might be on the Turnpike, and those were already named after famous people, so I don't think they'll be changing any of those.
Well, thank you very much. Like I said, the chat is mostly with thank you for a great presentation. And this was, it was, and I hope, like I said, I'll send out the information and maybe some of us will go exploring and going to look for some of these different state parks. There's certainly plenty by us right here. We don't even have to go that far away.
Wow.
So with that, I'm going to stop with the